Okay, so this talk is about essentially the work I've been doing for the last couple of years in a field called unsupervised feature learning, and I'll tell you a little bit about sort of the idea behind unsupervised feature learning in a minute. But the talk is titled Demystifying Unsupervised Feature Learning, because as I'll explain, it's sort of been a murky field since these things emerged in the last 5 or 6 years. What we've been doing is trying to simplify them and really understand what's going on here. But before I get into the details, I want to kind of motivate this with some personal history, which is how I got started in machine learning. So I took a class in machine learning. Of course, you have this wonderful story about we're going to have a computer, and it's going to have this learning algorithm. We're going to give it data. We're going to give it some images of things we'd like it to understand, and some images of, or some things like audio signals. And we're going to teach it to predict, for instance, that this is a car, hopefully not a cat. Or maybe we'd be very happy if it said cat. Or we'd like it to recognize that this audio waveform is somebody saying the word for. Unfortunately, this is not the way it ends up working at all. It turns out that if you want to do either of these kinds of applications, you really have to spend a great deal of time. And the place where I first learned about this was actually, as Peter said, working on this autonomous helicopter. So this is a really cool project. We got some great results. For instance, used some machine learning algorithms to teach this helicopter to fly aerobatic maneuvers, kind of like a human can. But you would think that the hardest thing about this project is to get some control algorithm that's really precise and can fly this aerial lawnmower in a way that's very aggressive and so forth. But it turns out that that's not the problem at all. It turns out that the hardest thing here is figuring out how the helicopter behaves at all, learning to recognize if you take one action, what's going to follow it. And that's just a very simple machine learning problem, but by far, it's the thing that eats up all of your time. So you'd think the way that this should go is that we start, we can put our helicopter together fairly quickly, we get some sensors and control signals, and then we're going to have our machine learning algorithm, and voila, we'll have an aerobatic helicopter. It should be nice and easy. That's what the marketing brochure says. But it turns out that instead of taking you 6 months to build your helicopter and 3 months to implement your favorite machine learning algorithm, it takes a great deal longer. Instead, you need to learn about a whole bunch of other things. And if you go through our previous papers, you'll find tons and tons of jargon and special case stuff that you've got to know about if you really want to understand what that helicopter is doing. You need to sort of bake a lot of this in to your system in order to make things work well. So I only have a point estimate of this, but it turns out it takes like 5 years to make this work instead of 9 months. So I learned this a second time, unfortunately. After Peter and I wrapped up the helicopter work, I also started doing a bit of computer vision for robotics and learned this lesson a second time. And all we wanted to do was have this robot identify objects so that it could pick them up. We were interested in things like grasping and planning, and how do you get robots to do something useful. So you'd think that we could just apply machine learning again. Give it some images of things that are coffee mugs, images of things that are not coffee mugs, put it through our machine learning algorithm, and then we would be able to test each location of this image and ask, is this a coffee mug? Simple machine learning problem. But again, it turns out if you just do straight machine learning and you are not a computer vision expert, you end up with things that look like this. And it turns out that if you want to do well, again, we have to have lots and lots and lots of prior knowledge. And we've got to bake a lot of that into these systems. And there's been an awful lot of work trying to figure out what are all the little things you need to get these applications to work well. So machine learning has really only been part of the solution, but we need a ton of cleverness to get these things to work well. So a good question for machine learning people has been, why is this so darn hard? Why do we have to rely on our own intelligence to get these things to work? And one sort of cartoon for why this happens is if you think about trying to classify a coffee mug, trying to recognize that this is a coffee mug rather than just some random image, you could think about trying to describe this image in terms of just 2 pixel intensities. For instance, let's say that the intensity of these 2 pixels are 76 and 160, so I'm just going to represent it as a vector. And I can put this down on like a little scatter plot. And if I give you another coffee mug, then maybe it ends up over there, depending on the pixel intensities. And I can also do this for a bunch of images that are not coffee mugs, like a coffee cup from Starbucks, and like a piece of a table, and so forth. If you do this for a whole bunch of images, well, it's not that surprising that you get just some horrible scatter, because what the pixels are doesn't really tell you much about the image. And as a result, you can get very poor results. Because if I now ask you for a new point, is this a coffee mug, there's really no good way to know. So on the other hand, what if we can invent features? So one of the big parts in machine learning is to come up with some new representation that works much better. And one way to do computer vision applications, for instance, is to invent some sort of detector that finds parts. Let's say we have some detector that tells us how likely it is that there's a handle in this image, and how likely it is that there's a cylinder in this image. And then if I plot those features on this scatter plot, it's very nice because we know that things that have handles and look sort of cylindrical tend to be coffee mugs. And now if I ask you the same question, is this a coffee mug? Now it's very obvious what a good answer would be. So this is the role that features play in machine learning. It's kind of been a fundamental area of research for a long time. But unfortunately, it is the thing that eats all of our time, because we take our original pixel intensities for this image, and then we have this feature extraction stage, followed by some machine learning. And unfortunately, this feature extraction stage is the thing that eats up all of our time. It's sort of like encoding all of our prior knowledge and experience about the world into our learning algorithms. So this is what we had to do with the helicopter to some degree. This is what we have to do with robotics, computer vision, audio, speech, and so on. So what we wanted to do is figure out a way to actually learn these things. And that's the topic of what we've been working on for the last several years, called unsupervised feature learning. And the idea is that instead of taking this feature extraction system and trying to bake all of our prior knowledge into it by hand, what we'd like to do is replace this with a new component that we're going to call an unsupervised feature learning algorithm. And what this system does is it looks at unlabeled examples, things that we can get off the web or that we can collect very easily. And it will try to learn this feature extraction system automatically for us. And so what I'm going to talk about in this talk is the things that go into this box and how they work. So just as a crash course, I want to talk about a simple example of how you might go about this. Because it may not be clear if I don't let you see what's inside this machine learning box over here. How is it possible to learn a feature extraction system without knowing what you're going to do with it? So it turns out that there are still good ideas for how to make this happen. So let's imagine that I give you this 14 by 14 pixel image patch. And initially, I represent it by 196 pixel intensities. So this vector is not very informative, because each one of these little pixels tells me almost nothing about what's going on here. And we know from all of our previous experience, if you just dump this into your machine learning algorithm, it almost never works especially well. So what we want to do is find a way to convert this into something that is a better feature vector. So one way that people have tried is to start out by saying, I want to find a basis, a set of vectors from which I can reconstruct my input, but using only a small number of them. So for instance, if each one of these little question mark boxes here is another 14 by 14 image patch, and I've got a whole bunch of them, maybe thousands of them, I'd like to choose them so that whenever I see a new patch, I can reconstruct it by taking a linear combination where most of these A1, 2, 3, and so on are 0. So I'm only allowed to use a small number of them at any given time from a large bank. So this algorithm is called sparse coding, and the way that we use it is we can go on the web, we can download a whole bunch of unlabeled images, and then we can crop out little patches, for instance, and then use an unsupervised learning algorithm to find all the basis functions that go in those little question mark boxes. So if you do that, it turns out that the basis functions you should use are these little patches here. They basically look like edge filters. So the idea is that this unsupervised learning algorithm has figured out that if you want to express or you want to represent small images very compactly with very few elements each, then a good idea is to represent them in terms of images. So now if we want to use all these learned features, which is sort of like background knowledge about how images work, then whenever we see a new image, we can try to find this small number of elements in this set of basis functions that allow us to reconstruct this image. So for instance, this guy might be represented by 0.8 times this first basis function, 0.3 times this guy, and 0.5 times this one. Add them together and you get back your original image. And then we can just take these coefficients and put them into a feature vector. So here's this vector A that had all the coefficients from the last slide. And as you can see, most of them are 0, corresponding to all these elements that we didn't use. And then there are only 3 non-zeros. And this is sort of cool because this feature vector is now a higher level representation of our image patch. It's no longer this dense 196-dimensional vector of intensities that we can't make much sense of. In fact, we only have 3 non-zero values, and they represent how much of each of these edges is in my image. So in a sense, we now have a nice little edge detector that this system has invented for us. And hopefully, if we use this feature vector in machine learning algorithms, it'll work much better. So this is actually the starting point for a sort of template for how you can just build unsupervised feature learning algorithms. We don't have to use sparse coding, which is a sort of neuroscience-inspired algorithm from, actually from Bruno Olshausen, who's not here right now. He's up in Rift. But basically, what we want to do is take all of our unlabeled data. We'll take some unsupervised learning algorithm. You can pick just about anything you want. It could be a clustering algorithm, could be EM with some sort of graphical model, it could be just about anything you want. We'll take the parameters, the learned features that we got from this, and then we're going to define an encoding scheme. And in the previous case, the encoding scheme was to go back and find the coefficients that represent our image, but we could choose almost anything we want here. And then the result is that you get a feature vector out, and you can drop this into your favorite machine learning algorithm. So one of the things that we did a couple of years ago was to ask, we have all these algorithms. We have sparse coding, we have things like restricted Boltzmann machines, and lots of fancy unsupervised learning algorithms that can go into that very same template. And the trouble was that we had a lot of confusing results in the literature. We had some very simple algorithms that seemed to work pretty darn well. We had some really complicated algorithms that were expensive to run and worked poorly. And yet, no matter what, every year you would go to NIPS or ICML or whatever, and someone had done much better on all of the benchmarks. And it wasn't clear where any of that was coming from. What are the main ideas that make these algorithms tick? Why do they work so well? So we decided to embark on this study of these feature learning algorithms, and in the way that a biologist or a astronomer or someone wants to study a creature under their microscope, we decided to ask, what is the simplest algorithm that fits into this template I showed you that could possibly work? With the hope being that if we could understand that algorithm, we had a sort of Drosophila of feature learning algorithms, we could take it apart and figure out what's going on. So we took this template, and all we need to do to get a feature learning algorithm is to drop an unsupervised learning algorithm into this box, and then put some kind of encoding scheme into this box down here. So we thought, well, what's the simplest unsupervised learning algorithm that we can think of? And I took 229 many years before, which is our machine learning class at Stanford, and I said, well, I guess it's going to be k-means. It's the simplest unsupervised learning algorithm I could think of. It's a clustering algorithm. It's not very intelligent, but it's very fast and very simple to implement. And then for the encoder, well, wasn't clear what to do with k-means. In computer vision, people had used k-means to learn features for quite a while. And so it turns out that there's some soft assignment tricks that people have come up with that worked pretty well for defining new features based on the results of k-means. So we put these things together, and we tried it out on one of the main benchmarks in feature learning at the time called CFAR 10. It's a simple 10-class recognition problem where I show you a little image and I ask you to tell me, is it an automobile, a dog, a frog, or so on. So there are a whole bunch of results, and it really epitomized the confusion that all these results are really only a few months apart, and yet something fairly sophisticated like a mean covariance RBM would give you 65% accuracy on this problem. Something called local coordinate coding, which is also a pretty sophisticated algorithm that's very similar to sparse coding, gave you a much better result, 74%, although it wasn't clear why. And then what seemed to be an incredibly simple algorithm by comparison, but which was closely related to this RBM, had the best result at the time, which is about close to 79%. So we took our k-means algorithm, ran our pipeline through this, and it turned out you could get almost 80%. And this is actually a pipeline that's very close to sort of existing computer vision systems. It wasn't clear why on earth is it possible to use such a simple algorithm in the exact same framework as all these other things are being applied and do so much better. So we decided to start digging into this to find out what was going on. And one of the first things that you might do is think, well, let's look at what these algorithms are actually learning. And one way we can do that is visualize the features that come out of each algorithm. And it turns out that k-means is actually learning these little edge filters, just like all of the other algorithms are. And in the past, some other authors had found that you could learn edge filters kind of like k-means, although there were learn edge filters very similarly to what sparse coding was giving us, but they were missing a couple of ingredients. But once you got the right bits and pieces put together, you get these edge filters that look suspiciously like the filters that we get from pretty much every other algorithm. So it turns out that if you use sparse coding, which is the example I was showing on the previous slides, you learn edge detection. If you use a sparse RBM, you learn edge detection, and so on. So it seemed to be the case that even though k-means is a clustering algorithm, for some reason it ends up learning the same kinds of features.
I mean, I should note that this has been known by people in computer vision and used since at least 1990. I mean, and in 1999, I would say there are pictures with all of this stuff.
Right. So I've seen
it's somehow that in the machine learning community, this trend was missed because for whatever reason. But in the computer vision community, I would say that the use of k-means for producing features was not a side trend, but really the main line from our work in 1999 and Civic and Zisserman and a million others.
Right.
You know, the whole paradigm of bag of words was always based on k-means.
Yes. So a lot of the examples, so for instance, Andrew Zisserman with Pharma, correct?
Yeah, that was after our work. Yeah.
Right. So there are a couple of differences, though, that will affect this pretty dramatically. It turns out that you need a sort of neuroscience-inspired preprocessing that goes before this. So one thing that you'll see in, I dare say, most of the examples where people apply k-means to image patches, you'll see very low-frequency filters, and they turn out not to work very well at all. They're much more like patch exemplars, and there is a reason for that, and I'll talk about it in a little bit. But even predating the 90s, right, there are some neuroscientists who apparently by accident tried taking their preprocessing pipeline, putting k-means on top of it, and did find things that look like this. So this is, in fact, a very old result, although it doesn't seem to be the case that people had couched it in the same framework as these other algorithms. So once we've sort of figured out that, okay, k-means is learning these things, and we did, in fact, find some prior work that recognized that k-means is going to learn edge-like filters. Thought, okay, that's one step in the right direction, but it still didn't explain why we're doing better. This explains why maybe it should perform about the same, but it didn't explain why we're doing better. So another experiment that we tried was to find out how much this soft assignment thing that we put in mattered. Could it be that it doesn't matter what filters you have, what really matters is how do you encode that feature vector at the end? And that turns out to be true. So some sort of classic results that you'll find in the computer vision literature, even in previous work in neuroscience, is that if you use sparse coding and then you use this vector A for your features, people would get really high results, and it seemed like it was just a strictly better algorithm. And you'd use k-means and you'd use some hard assignment trick, which was the way to do it previously, that everyone sort of recognized did not work as well, which is why we used a soft assignment scheme. But then you could even do things like just picking random patches. Don't bother using k-means at all, and use a soft assignment, like a soft threshold, and get very comparable results. So one thing we tried was to look at all these unusual combinations, the combinations that usually didn't make much sense, but you could put them together anyway. And it turns out that when you look at all of those results, the thing that matters is not which of your training algorithms you use, but actually how you encode this feature vector. So that seemed to be another explanation for where all this extra performance was coming from. And finally, something that kind of informed our looking at this was something that had been happening in machine learning sort of repeatedly, was people would get better and better results on, say, natural language processing or speech or computer vision. And it would turn out that every 6 months we'd get a bigger computer, we'd run a bigger model with more data, and you'd get better results. And that it was actually not necessarily algorithmic changes that were yielding these performance benefits, but scaling up. And that led to this last experiment here, which seemed to show that no matter which algorithm we used, each of these lines represents the performance of a different algorithm on this CFAR10 data set for a different number of features. What would happen is as you increase the number of features, which is down here on the x-axis, any algorithm you would pick could do better. So if you start out and you learn, say, 200 or 400 features, which is what people would previously do here because it was very expensive, and instead you scaled up to, say, 1,600 features, then you could suddenly do much better. And as a result, we sort of thought, wow, if it's really the case that the difference in performance between large models and small models tends to be bigger than the difference in performance between two different kinds of models, maybe the thing we care about is actually making these things run at much larger scale rather than worrying about all the little tweaks to make it work. So the conclusions from all this were that sometimes scaling up actually is more useful than inventing a new algorithm. It seemed like all the algorithms we had were learning the same sorts of features. We basically reinvented edge detection like 100 times, which was not an especially useful investment of our time. And in fact, it turned out that when you just scaled up an algorithm like k-means that, as you point out, Jitendra, computer vision people have been using for quite a while, you can actually beat all of these systems on image recognition. And yet there was also this little bit of a mystery, which is that k-means does work about as well as any other sparse learning method. We could find cases where just drawing random image patches was not that great. You would think that that should work about as well as k-means. But it turns out not to. So that was one lingering question. So when we were done with all of this, we sort of had explained empirically why we got these great results, but we didn't really understand why our particular choice of algorithms was giving us this kind of performance. In particular, it wasn't clear why k-means worked so well relative to, say, just random image patches. We were using hard-coded invariants. We're just using image pooling, which is a common practice in computer vision. And finally, whenever you stack these things up, you try to build a hierarchical model, it seemed not to work very well. So there's a paper by Agarwal and Triggs, for instance, that's a lot like a spatial pyramid architecture where they tried to build a deep set of features based on these algorithms, and it didn't work, and we couldn't understand why. So we wanted to try to dig into this, and to understand why any of this works, we started looking at k-means and how it compared to other sparse learning methods from the feature learning literature. So it turns out that k-means is actually seeking heavy-tailed directions in the input distribution. So normally we think of k-means as a clustering algorithm, but with a few modifications, so that you use cosine distance between points instead of Euclidean distance. It turns out that k-means turns into a very weak form of sparse learning algorithm. It actually hunts down projections of your data that have heavy-tailed distributions. So for instance here, there's this scatter plot of two independent heavy-tailed random variables. So you can see there's a sort of heavy tail out here and a heavy tail out here. It's not Gaussian. And k-means will actually seek these heavy tails. So if you try to do somewhat more sophisticated things, it turns out you can do things like blind source separation. For instance, you can take a bunch of pixels that are randomly drawn independently from sparse distributions. If you take a bunch of gradings and mix them according to some independent heavy-tailed random variables, and if you take some edges and combine them with weights that are also drawn from a heavy-tailed distribution, you get images that look like this. And then if you just run k-means clustering on them, you can actually recover the original bases that would be recovered, for instance, by something like sparse coding or ICA. So these things were showing up, for instance, in Olshausen and Field back in the 90s when they were working with sparse coding algorithms and showing how you can actually take apart these complicated distributions and figure out what are the underlying sources that might generate them. And surprisingly, you can actually use k-means to do the same thing, even though it's not obvious that it'll do that just from the notion that it's a clustering algorithm. So we can actually compare this to things like ICA, and it turns out that if you look at the responses of these things as linear filters, so for instance, if I take one of these Gabor filters and I multiply it by one of the input images, I'll get some value from that dot product, and then I can look at the distribution of those values for a whole bunch of different patches. If you do that, then you get some density, and this is a plot of the log density against the magnitude of the responses, like a histogram of all the responses. And it turns out that k-means is learning these incredibly sparse projections that are about as sparse as you can get from ICA or sparse coding or another algorithm, and they're much more sparse than randomly chosen patches, and certainly more sparse than just randomly selected filters you initialize with noise. So it seems to say that k-means is actually a weak sort of sparse learning method. It's not explicitly designed to find sparse projections, but empirically that's what ends up happening once you combine it with these other ingredients we found. So once you know that this is true, it actually becomes possible to exploit some of the other knowledge that's come out of natural image statistics and feature learning to make k-means do things very similar to more sophisticated algorithms to learn invariant features. So I'm going to start out by just showing you a sort of toy data set so that you can see what k-means is going to do and how we can exploit that to build invariant features that are invariant to things like translation and scale and so on. So I'm going to start out with two random variables, sigma 1 and sigma 2, and they're just distributed independently according to some Laplace distributions. Heavy-tailed, it's not Gaussian. And then I'm going to take three coefficients, A1, 2, 3, that are just unit Gaussians. And then I'm going to define these three variables, x, y, and z, where z is the product of A3 and sigma 2. And as a result, z is some heavy-tailed random variable itself. But x and y are the product that share a single scale parameter. So as a result, z, you can work out, is independent of x and y. But x and y share a very special kind of dependence. In particular, they share a scale correlation. And yet, if you check, x and y are actually linearly uncorrelated. So if you were to try to fit a Gaussian to them or something, you would see that their covariance is actually diagonal. So if you look at an isocontour of this density function, you see these sort of two upside-down circus tents. And the interesting thing about this distribution is that z is independent, but x and y have this sort of disk shape. If you could sort of visualize what the density is like as you move away, it's like having heavy tails in all directions as you fan out from that center axis. And then this special kind of dependence between x and y is something that people in image statistics have been looking at for a while. And the idea is that we want to find this subspace so that we can build invariant features. So let's just look at what k-means does when you apply it to this kind of distribution. So first we're going to do preprocessing. Just like everyone in computer vision and neuroscience, we're going to normalize all of our data so that it's on a sphere. And if you look at the density of that distribution, you see you have a whole bunch of points up here where it's very dense at the poles. And then you also have this belt kind of around the middle where it's more dense than anywhere else. And then you have these gaps. If you apply k-means to this, we said k-means was sort of like a sparse learning algorithm. It tends to hunt down those heavy tails, or said another way, it hunts down these areas where there's higher density on this sphere. So it turns out you get results that look like this, where k-means will tend to plunk down centroids that are near these poles in the independent directions. But when you have this special sort of dependence, then you end up trying to cover that entire subspace. Instead of just putting two basis vectors that are orthogonal and trying to span it, you end up trying to fill it in with k-means because you run it with a lot more centroids than you have dimensions. So the idea that came out of the natural image statistics literature is that these subspaces, this x and y variables, are called an invariant subspace. It means that they are not themselves, they are sparse, but they share this scale dependence. In fact, as far back, this is not even the earliest reference, well back into the 80s, people were aware of this kind of statistical structure and the fact that you could discover things like complex cell-like behaviors, meaning that there were features that could detect edges, and if that edge moved back and forth, the neuron would stay turned on. It's like complex cells in human visual cortex. But rather than using something quite complicated like group lasso or group sparse autoencoders and so on that exploit this structure with numerical algorithms, turns out you can do something really boneheaded to build features like this using just agglomerative clustering. So in that previous picture, all we have to do is use agglomerative clustering to group these centroids together. So whenever I have a whole bunch of centroids living down here, I can do single link clustering to start from a single point, add a couple of neighbors in, and then once I've added those neighbors to the group, I can find some other nearby points and add them to the group and keep going until I run out of neighbors. And the interesting thing about this is that it will group together all these centroids that are sharing this XY subspace here, but it's going to ignore this guy up here because the gap between them is too big. And once we have those groups, let's say we have one group and we call it G, then we can take the response of all of these linear filters and then just take the max of all of their responses. Now, if you imagine taking a data point that's over here on the left, let's say that it represents an edge in a particular location, then this linear filter is going to respond, and that means when I take the max, my max pooling unit is also going to respond. And as I take that point and I move it around this belt to the other side, which might correspond to an edge that is translating in my image, you're going to get different linear filters that respond at each location. And when I take the max, I'm going to have a feature now that turns on and stays on for as long as I'm living down in this little belt here. If I ever try to leave the XY plane, all of these filters will turn off, the max pooling unit will turn off, and as a result, you now have features that are a lot like complex cells in the brain. They can detect edges, for instance, at different locations, but if that edge ever changes orientation or disappears, the feature will turn off. So again, if you apply this to natural images, you get a whole bunch of features that look like this, and it turns out that if you apply this single link clustering to them, you actually get features that look this way. And the reason that this works is actually pretty non-obvious. If you just take random image patches and you try to do the single link clustering, you will get things that are not translation invariant. You will get all kinds of other sort of strange pooling units that don't match up with biology, they don't match up with any of the other theory that we have. But once you recognize that k-means is essentially a weak sparse learning algorithm, you can import all of this theory from natural image statistics, and you can figure out that this is the right thing to do. And in fact, when you apply this single link clustering, you can build these pooling units that become invariant to translation, which is sort of what we would expect. So once we had figured that out, we thought, okay, well, now we're really armed with something improved. We're no longer having to hard code our invariances. And we also have these very scalable algorithms. In the past, algorithms that could learn this kind of invariance were very expensive to run, so you're sort of limited in the size of model that you can build. So we were thinking to ourselves, all right, what can we actually build? Can we make a model that's much, much larger than other people could deploy? And also, our features have extremely sparse responses, as I showed you one of those previous density plots. And that tends to mean that these things are very interpretable. If a neuron, if a single feature only turns on very rarely, it's much easier to tell what that thing codes for. So hopefully we could dig into these systems and find out what they're actually learning. And that might tell us something not only about k-means and about our algorithms, but tell us something about what other algorithms in feature learning are actually coming up with. So here's an interesting result from several years ago that kind of informed our thinking on this. So Hong-Lak Lee built something called a convolutional deep belief network, which has a hand-coded translation invariance in it. It's like a pooling system in computer vision. And a deep belief network is basically a multi-layered probabilistic model. And what he showed is that when you apply this to labeled data, where you have, say, 4 classes or 5 classes or something, this algorithm can actually learn to decompose those images into parts and then learn how to put those parts together to form whole images like faces or cars or chairs and things like that. But one sort of interesting thing, though, is that this was run on labeled data, where it's already pretty clear that you have faces and cars because they don't look too much alike. So even though this is a pretty cool result and got people very excited at the time about building these hierarchical models, it was also a very restricted application. So we wondered, with a large enough model, something that we could actually build using these very scalable clustering algorithms that we put together, is it actually possible now to do this with unlabeled data? If I actually just go on the web and just start downloading garbage, and I run my unsupervised learning algorithms on it, is it possible that we will learn features that figure out how to discover objects? So for instance, one thing we thought might be interesting is to go and look at a whole bunch of YouTube thumbnails and then ask, are there any object-selected features in our system? And to make life even more exciting, we decided to sort of control for the possibility that maybe it is that when people are filming things on YouTube, they tend to put people in the middle and so on. They tend to nicely frame their subject, which is a little bit like supervision creeping in there in your data set. We thought, no. We want the algorithm to have a really hard time, not to have any cues created by human beings. So we took away the color, so you can't just look for flesh-toned things to find people. And we also took away the nice cropping. So we took a bunch of patches cropped from random positions and random scales in the images. So this is about as unlabeled a data set as we could think of. So we started out with about 1.4 million YouTube thumbnails. We chopped them up into about 60 million patches, and then we dropped them into this feature learning algorithm, which is really just some pre-processing steps, k-means clustering, and this agglomerative clustering scheme that I told you about to build max pooling units. And then we built a 4-layered hierarchy where it's alternating layers of these k-means trained features and then max pooling units built with this agglomerative clustering algorithm. So there are 4 layers total. And the question we had was, can we find neurons up at these higher layers, or features up at these higher layers that are selective for object classes? Is it actually possible to discover those things even without any supervision at all? So we already saw what this algorithm learns at the bottom layers. We saw that it learns these sparse edge detectors at the first layer, and then it learns these translation invariant edge detectors at the next layer up. And so after that, we wanted to know, well, what's the 3rd layer doing? What's that next round of k-means going to learn for us? So it turns out that if you go poking through these neurons and trying to visualize what it is that they detect, you can find some that respond very strongly for faces, which is the most common object on YouTube. So even though there's nothing special about faces other than they occur reasonably frequently, they're never nicely cropped, you can actually find features that detect faces at a particular location and scale with some local distortion. And there's no supervision involved in actually finding these. In fact, these were extracted from the unlabeled data set by this feature. And just to kind of summarize what each of those guys is looking at, you can average all of them together. So here's what that looks like for a whole bunch of different neurons. So there are maybe about 20 to 30 neurons or features in the system that are selected for faces, and if we visualize a few of them, you can see that they're selected for faces at different locations and different scales. But what's interesting about this is that these are sparse projections of my data set again. So we said from the beginning that k-means is this sparse learning algorithm, so it's not that helpful to think of these as being exemplars. K-means is not just trying to cover the entire data set with cluster centroids, it's actually looking for very specific subspaces. And if that's true, then we should be able to apply that agglomerative clustering algorithm we talked about again and link all of these guys together, which wouldn't be possible in pixel space because these things are too far apart. They don't look anything alike when you look at the raw pixels. But when you look at the features, when you look at the centroids that represent these, they're actually much closer together. So, in fact, you can find a complex cell, as we call them, or a pooling unit at these higher layers that groups together a whole bunch of faces at different locations and different scales. And if you go hunting through your unlabeled data set for patches that cause this unit to turn on very strongly, you get things that look like this. So this is a random sampling of the top, I think, 5,000 patches that cause this unit to turn on. And you can see that they are all pretty much faces, different positions, different scales. Often you'll see faces that are very closely cropped, up close, sometimes only partial faces. I'm looking for a good example here. Some of them are more like portraits, where the person is set back a little bit. We've even found things like Star Wars stormtroopers, a whole bunch of things that look only loosely like a face, and yet because they have the right structure and so on, are getting picked up anyway. And even the false positives that are in here, sometimes there's a record. I don't know if anybody see that one. It's basically a circle, but because of the print and the little circle in the middle ends up looking a little bit like a face. So this seems very promising. It says that if we have a big enough model and we exploit these sparse learning principles that have come out of previous literature in a very scalable way, we can actually learn hierarchies like this. And so far, we don't see any reason to believe that you can't learn huge numbers of objects this way. So that's pretty cool. So born out of the very same theoretical ideas that are behind all these other feature learning algorithms, it turns out you don't need a whole lot. Maybe it's the case that there's something special about sparse coding or sparse autoencoders or a bag of words hierarchies, spatial pyramid models, different kinds of kernel methods, and so on that we don't yet know about. But it sure seems to be that if I strip away everything else and I implement sparse selective features and group sparse invariant features in the simplest way I can think of, you can actually do something pretty sophisticated like find objects from unlabeled data. So I want to tell you just rapidly here about some recent work that sort of goes along with this. So some people may be familiar with this result from Google that was recently in the New York Times. It was a collaboration between my lab mate Kwok Lei, of course Andrew Ng, and a bunch of guys over at Google, where they trained up a very deep neural network using an objective that's very similar to this group sparsity criterion that I've been talking about that lets you find invariant features. And they've actually shown that you can find things that look like upper bodies of people and, in fact, cats. I don't know if the contrast is high enough to see it here. But in fact, if you go looking for what is the optimal response of some of these neurons, it turns out that this cat has like little ears, and it has kind of a grading that's very similar to what cats look like. And if you go hunting and you do these patch visualizations, where you find the patches in your data set that strongly activate this neuron, it turns out that by and large, most of them are cats. So even though this has got a billion parameters and it's trained on a huge cluster and so on, you can actually boil those basic ideas down into a much simpler system that you can run in your own basement. So unfortunately, this is pretty difficult for us to duplicate. My own back-of-the-envelope calculation says this costs $4 million if you want to do it yourself. It's pretty unreliable just by the numbers. When you've got 1,000 machines, the probability that a machine goes down because somebody goofed up is really high. So you have to have a ton of engineering to deal with all that. And of course, that means we can't build one. We calculated it would probably take about half of the Gates basement at Stanford, and we use about a megawatt of power. So this is definitely not something we can do ourselves. But we really want to be able to get up to this scale, so that whether we're using k-means or sparse coding or any kind of algorithm, we really think the most exciting things start to happen at very large scales. So that's certainly been true thus far. So something that I'm working on right now, please be quiet about, is that we're trying to duplicate this system using a lot more computing power and a lot fewer machines, in particular by leveraging graphics processing cards. So sort of preliminary prototype that we're working on now is actually able to train from 10 million 200 by 200 images, which is well over 1 trillion input values to train from. It has about 1.5 billion parameters and 9 layers of features, and it processes something like 200 images a second. It's spinning through this whole several terabyte data set. Takes about 14 hours. So this is just 3 machines so far. We're hoping we'll be up to 20-something machines soon. So it used to be the case that when you trained these feature banks, people would publish papers and say, look, I trained this huge feature bank. This is actually one of mine. But they say, oh, it's like 2,000 features. The largest ones I had done previously were maybe 6,000 features. So you'll find folks doing that. But now these visualizations, we can't put them in papers anymore because they look like this. So this is one of 8 feature maps. There's something like 300,000 neurons in this system, and they are all unique filters with over 1,000 weights each. So this is a massive neural network, and it takes maybe an afternoon to train. You can actually look at all of these things in here, and you can see it's a very sophisticated structure and organization being worked out based on these group sparsity criteria. The same things that are currently in our algorithms. So there's every reason to think that these kinds of features will let us do things like discovering objects on Flickr and so forth. So to sort of wrap up, at a high level, feature learning and deep learning, trying to build these deep hierarchies of invariant features is now pretty routine in the community. We found that clustering algorithms, surprisingly, can build them too. Not because, just because clustering algorithms scale up really well, but also it turns out that with a few extra tweaks, they turn out to implement essentially the same principles that everybody else is working off of. And when you couple this with really scalable computing systems, really cool stuff starts to happen. So for instance, we can actually discover object classes, and it's at least hypothetically possible that if we could scale this up enough, we might even learn to detect these objects pretty accurately. For instance, the features that we have now, when you test them like a little face detector, you take a single feature and ask, if I use that thing as a face detector, how well does it do? It actually works better than very simple supervised baselines. So if I take a linear SVM or some very weak algorithm, and I train it with labeled data, I actually tell it what I want it to do. Just because it's such a simple model, it actually can't learn to detect faces as well as these unsupervised learning algorithms can. And finally, building their own invariants and building these invariances using statistical algorithms, learning algorithms like the one I've talked about, is potentially a huge boon. We don't, right now, we're learning scale invariants, which is actually not a completely trivial thing to learn. It's not clear why scale invariance is such a great idea based purely on the statistics of the data. And yet that is what falls out. We're also starting to see some hints of out-of-plane rotation, some 3D rotation. So hopefully, if we can scale these things up enough, we don't need to hand code this knowledge anymore. You can actually pick it out of your data set. And our future plans are really centered around this question. If our current system scales up as well as we think it can, what would we be doing with 1,000 times as much computing power as we've been able to use in the past? So that's roughly what's happening. Maybe it's as simple as saying, let's just discover more objects and more invariances. But some other things we're excited about is maybe we could just completely solve certain kinds of objects. If you're willing to pay someone to get tons and tons of labeled data, maybe these very scalable systems will let you just completely eliminate a certain object from publication because you could just solve it. And finally, just sort of something to scratch our heads about is that, in all of our work here and work in the literature, we always use just the top layer. And we're really interested in what is going on inside. And it's been very hard to do that. In computer vision, we're always thinking about building up part models and so on. It's very interpretable and very nice. You can sort of debug them and figure out what's going on. But a lot of these algorithms, unfortunately, are sort of launch and leave. And then when you get a result, you actually don't know what's going on inside. So figuring out how to do something like segmentation or dealing with something called the binding problem that's related to neuroscience, those are pretty exciting and future directions for this kind of stuff. So thank you very much for listening, and happy to take any questions.
So, two quick questions. So one is in this agglomerative clustering. Could you explain maybe a little bit what metric you use for clustering? Is it just the same image?
Yeah, it's literally just inner products between those two centroids. So they're normalized, so it's just cosine distance.
And do you have for hierarchical models classification size? So that's the hierarchy. That's the second stage really help you in the classification.
Yes. So if you, as a sort of control experiment, let's say you try to run k-means on just 32 by 32 patches, right? You might hope that eventually you're going to find a centroid that looks like a face, right? If you run it large enough. But it turns out that those are not especially selective for faces. It's just a linear filter. And as a result, you'll see, for instance, that, okay, anything that looks like a face clearly makes this activate, but there are also lots of kind of blurry, round things that also cause it to turn on. It's not very selective. And of course, if the face ever moves, you still can't recognize it. But once you go deep, once you have these multiple layers of invariant and selective features, you can find that you're now translation invariant and scale invariant, but you don't lose selectivity. You're actually still selective for things that look just like faces that have that pattern. Yeah.
The number of image patches that you need to train up your system, how does that compare with the number of images that a baby sees in the first few years of its life? So it gets to the point where it's
That's a good question. I haven't worked it out. So 50 million, not sure how long that would take. I know that, so for instance, 10 million images, that's several days of full frame rate video. So for 50 million, it's probably like over a week, assuming that a baby could only see 32 by 32.
There's an obvious thing which is not being used here, which is the fact that, which is very important for babies, which is temporal coherence. So the binding problem is solved by motion grouping, which is a basic that children are born with it. So when an object moves, then you know from time instant to time instant that it's the same object, and it separates out the object from the background and so on. So this setup is really the equivalent of saying that you would learn language from collections of sentences. We know children don't learn language like that, nor should we assert that children learn vision from collection of image patches. They have motion available as a binding cue, just like in the case of language, there are other social contexts which have.
Yeah, so one interesting thing to add to that is that you can think of temporal coherence and these sorts of algorithms as hunting for the same statistical phenomenon in the data, but with two different implementations. So it's not clear to me how the brain does it. It may well be temporal coherence, in fact, likely temporal coherence for humans to do this. But for computers to implement this, what you're really looking for is lots of things that are very close together in your data set, kind of looking for a manifold. And so unfortunately, humans, of course, the easiest way for us is to realize that if I just saw something move, well, those points must all be close together in my input space. But a computer doesn't have to do that. It could potentially just do batch processing, and once you've seen billions of images, that whole space is filled in. You've seen something that goes in each of those locations, and you can actually back that out.
Given you have YouTube videos, though, I guess there's no reason you couldn't use
We
temporal
could.
coherence.
Yeah. So there is some work on how to use, people call it the slowness principle, how to use temporal coherence to do these things. I haven't seen anything that gets up to these kinds of scales. I think some of it is actually collecting the data. It's actually kind of annoyingly hard to get YouTube videos downloaded. But for the moment, I think for the things we wanted to do so far, it turns out you can get enough still images and enough variety to get some of this out. Yeah.
So on the part where you were showing, like, for a bunch of different algorithms, performance versus the size of the feature space, to me it looks like, definitely like going from 100 to 1600 was a huge improvement in performance, but it definitely is also looking like it's kind of your improvement after that is probably not going to be huge. So I'm kind of wondering, what is your motivation for thinking, if we really push on trying to get more computing power, we're going to do a lot better?
So there are a few unlisted caveats in there. So one is that we are using sort of a post-processing stage, a pooling system adopted from computer vision. And if you add lots and lots and lots of features, you end up averaging over a bunch of them, basically. And so each feature is giving you a little bit less information. And so we also have limited labeled data in those cases. So there's a fixed amount of labeled data for this benchmark. And eventually you just reach a limit where you just can't learn anything else from your labeled data with those features. What exactly is the limit of scaling? At what point does it make sense to stop? We don't know. But it sure seems like for a distribution that is sufficiently complicated with enough object classes, it actually does make sense to be very large.
But wasn't that plot also single layer? And
Yes, that's right.
Maybe something.
Yeah, so that plot was just a single layer. That's right. So there's only so much nonlinearity you can get there. So your representation can only be so powerful. When you add multiple layers, people have shown that you can get a little bit more out. But what seems to be the dividing line really for those benchmarks is how much labeled data you've got. So those benchmarks, I think, show in spirit how much scale can buy you. But what that means for unsupervised learning and for learning hundreds of objects and so on, we don't know. Yeah.
So training these networks takes a lot of time, as you already said.
Mm-hmm.
Let's say you have a bunch of data and you train this network. Let's say you have, YouTube is growing every day, right? So it's tremendously growing. And the easiest way is to have more data, just retrain the whole thing. But maybe you don't want to retrain the whole net. Is there like a way to adapt each of these layers without doing all the retraining?
So
kind of continuously updating the thing.
You could do online learning. In fact, probably the most popular way to train deep neural nets at this point is just to do stochastic gradient descent. Plus or minus some step sizing tricks and all that. Batch training is definitely on the way out because it's just impossible with such big data sets. And so for something like that, as long as you remember your step size, you're welcome to just run on YouTube for as long as it goes. Yeah?
You've got these pooling. So pooling, say, basically the same feature at different locations. And so, given that the original representation is sparse, given a sparse representation there, effectively it's like having only one link active.
Correct.
Now, the question then is, do you make use of the knowledge of which link is active?
We do not. There are some models that are quite similar that do remember this information. So Rob Fergus, NYU, and his student Matt Zeeler have something they call a deconvolutional network. It's very closely related to sparse coding. So what they do is they have max pooling units. They're hard-coded into like who they're connected up to. But when you take the max, they remember which unit was the maximum. And when you know that, what you can actually do is invert the whole thing. So you can think of pooling as sort of smoothing out your inputs and discarding some information. But because they remember that switch location, which of these was the max, they can actually generate images from their model by using these switches again at the bottom layer. So how to make the best use of that, I'm not sure. And I don't know of anyone that has done it once you actually learn the pooling. But yeah, so that idea is floating around and gives some pretty cool results.
So on your pooling stage, where you're doing the clustering, you said did you try single link versus complete link? I mean, do you have this, don't you have this potential problem that you could just wind up linking everything together?
Right, yeah, so I didn't mention it in there. We do have a diameter limit that stops your cluster from growing indefinitely.
Because otherwise with single link,
Right.
when you have, as you have more and more dense data, everything will get linked to everything.
That's right. So because of the sparsity, you usually do have pretty big gaps. So in many cases, you really can just let single link clustering go, and it won't cover the whole data set. It'll run out of neighbors. It won't be able to jump the gap into some other subspace. But the diameter limit in practice is important.
So let me add a remark here. I think your contribution is actually that stage. Because the first stage, it may have been news to the machine learning crowd, which has got distracted with all these other ideas. But in computer vision, we've used k-means for producing features at least since 1999 in a very mainstream way, not as a side thing, but we did this for texture, we did this for line drawings, we did this for object features. I mean, it's been done at every stage. And I think the reason why some of those other versions didn't catch on in computer vision is probably because referees killed those papers, because always the argument would be how does it compare against a baseline, which would be the k-mean version. But from all the versions that we used to have, we would always have these multiple copies around. So,
So
like, I'll tell
multiple
you my
copies.
version of it, which is from 1999, which we call textons. You would have some local filter output which you would cluster, and obviously for an edge you would get these slightly shifted copies because at the edge, 1 pixel to the right, 2 pixels to the right, you're going to get different units for those. Now, in the way we use this in our architectures in computer vision, it didn't matter because we always had some stage which was doing a scanning over space. So since there was scanning over space, this invariance was built in.
Translation invariance, yeah.
Translation invariant, and we also scanned over scale.
Right,
So we
yeah.
basically did it in the outer loop, which was kind of brute forcing its way through.
Yes.
Now, what that doesn't do is a way of building hierarchies. So when you want to build hierarchies, you need to have this kind of embedded in there rather than in an algorithmic way. And by doing that group clustering, you effectively you get out of having to have an algorithm in there, and now you can do layers on top. So I believe that is actually the contribution. The first part is probably helpful for clearing cobwebs in the machine learning crowd, but it's actually it's very sensible. I like what you're doing, but I'm just putting it in place.
Add a piece to it. I think you're right that if machine learning folks had learned much sooner that look, k-means just does all this, that might have helped get to much better benchmark scores earlier. But I think what talking to neuroscience people, machine learning people, some vision people, like why is this particular result kind of handy? It's that I think it's connected all of those pieces. So in computer science and neuroscience, or machine learning and neuroscience, there's this notion like, oh, sparsity is important. And yet k-means didn't really embody that concept at all. And in fact, if you just do this without whitening and normalization and so on, it will actually fail. You'll just get these big muddy things and the single link clustering algorithm doesn't work anymore. And it's not clear at all why that's true. But once you connect k-means, which, like you say, has been done for ages, once you figure out how to make that mimic these other algorithms that are based on sparsity, it actually becomes much more powerful, and you can do things like learning the invariants. So I think you're right that algorithmically this has been done for ages and worked pretty darn well. And it's quite hard to beat, as many people have found now in deep learning. But the insight of this work that I think has sort of turned a few heads has been that they're more closely related than they look. And once you realize that k-means is not just building exemplars, which is the way we usually interpret it, it's actually finding sparse projections, now that connection is actually valuable. You can use the theory that guys like Varman and Cahonen have figured out and use that theory to do these things.
Let's thank Adam again.
Thanks, guys.